years, but I've never followed someone speaking about prostates. And so it's a hard act to follow. Can everyone hear me up the back there? Yeah. All right, great. Thank you again, Wendy. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today to speak to the Tasmanian Men's Shed Association. Just a little health warning, some of the material I'm going to talk about is a little bit intense, so if anyone does feel like they need to take a break, please feel free to do so. As Wendy mentioned, I'm the author of this book, Line in the Sand, which came out a couple of years ago. It's a memoir that I wrote, which took 7 years to write, and it's an account of the life I had as a foreign correspondent, and then my mental unraveling. The trauma that I experienced covering a lot of traumatic events overseas, then my psychiatric admissions, where I spent 77 days and nights with a lot of veterans and first responders, and where I learned what it was that I was suffering from and how to get on top of that. But most importantly, it was where I learned how to reconnect with my family and with my friends and with myself. And it was where I understood the power, the importance of human connection. And I think, to me, that's the sense that I get that underpins the men's sheds, that power of human connection. And that's one of the reasons I'm so happy to come here and speak to you all today. Before I go on, I just got a little question to ask you. Can anyone remember what was the world's top news story in 1989? 1989, biggest story in the world. What was it? Who wants to shout it out to me? Any? Berlin Wall, is that what I heard? That's exactly right. Berlin Wall came down in 1989. I was a young 21-year-old at the time, backpacking through Europe a few months after the wall had come down. And this is how I got into journalism. I found myself traveling through Eastern Europe, Russia, what was then the USSR, and it was just incredible being there in these places where communism had collapsed. People were experiencing freedom, democratic freedoms for the very first time. And I climbed the Berlin Wall, as you can see in that photo. And that had such a profound impact on me. At the time, I was actually working as an accountant for a firm called KPMG, which I'm sure you've all heard of. I'd studied economics, followed the strengths that I had at school. But when I did that, when I experienced that, I thought, I want to witness history. I want to see history being made. I want to cover war. And so after that 3 months that I had traveling through all these countries and seeing all this change, I came back home, went back home, I quit my job, and I thought, I'm going to become a journalist. What I didn't realise was that the media in Australia, they didn't care if you had an economics degree. They wanted to know if you could touch type or if you could take shorthand. I had none of those skills. So I ended up going to getting myself on a youth exchange program, and I ended up in Indonesia, where I was to spend a number of years learning the language and getting to understand the country. And eventually I was hired by a news organisation called Reuters, which at the time was the world's largest multimedia news organisation. And it was there working for Reuters that I was given this incredible opportunity to travel around Indonesia, travel around Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and cover the most amazing stories. Within 3 months of me joining this organisation, I was covering my first earthquake. Death toll was 200 people. It was a harbinger of what was to come. That's me on a river in Kalimantan, somewhere on Indonesia's side of Borneo. It was also during this time that I lived in Hong Kong during the handover of Hong Kong back to China from British rule, and it was where I met my wife, Mary Binks, who's a proud Tasmanian, and I consider myself a Tasmanian by marriage. And Mary at the time was working for Hong Kong media. She was a fellow journalist. She'd actually started at the Advocate and the Mercury, also worked at the ABC. And it was from Mary that I got my inspiration to want to go and cover war. Mary at the time, she's a bit older than me, she had been covering a lot of the more challenging stories compared to myself. She got detained in China covering protests by the banned Falun Gong movement. She was in East Timor when Australian troops went in there to restore order. So for me, it was Mary, my wife, was my inspiration. On the evening, I should say, of October 12, 2002, I was at home with my family in Jakarta, and I got a phone call from a stringer, our stringer in Bali. Stringers are local journalists who often do a bit of work for foreign media. And I could hear all this noise, all this commotion in the background. And I said, what's going on? And he said, the Sari Club in Denpasar, in Kuta, is ablaze. I said, tell me what you can see. He said, cars on fire and headless bodies. I knew that something terrible had happened. I sent a one-line alert to our editing desk in London, wrote a couple of paragraphs, jumped in the car, went straight to the office. What we later learned, of course, was that an L300 white minivan had exploded outside the Sari Club, killing 202 people, including 88 Australians. It was the worst terrorist attack since the 9/11 attacks on the US. I got on a plane, the first flight that flew into Bali the next morning, and was one of the first foreign journalists on the scene. And when I got to the scene, there was no police tape around the bomb site. It wasn't cordoned off. And I was actually literally able to walk right across the scene, the site itself. And when I got there, I felt this strange sensation. I could actually feel the evil in the air. And covering that story messed me up psychologically for 20 years. A year later, I was in Baghdad, Iraq. The US had invaded Iraq, as you'll all remember, on the assumption that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and was good friends with Osama bin Laden. This photo was taken in a little village called Al-Awja, which was Saddam's home village. I was embedded with a unit that was looking for Saddam Hussein. This was November 2003. And these soldiers, this unit, their job was to try and find Saddam. Little did we know, he was in a hole in the ground not far from where this photo was taken. While I was with this particular unit, this battalion, we would go out on patrol with them. And one night, when we were in the city called Tikrit, which I'm sure you've all heard of, we were in Humvees just creeping down a darkened road. It was maybe 1 a.m. And I said to this young soldier beside me, why are we going so slow? And he said, so that when they shoot at us, we'll see the muzzle flashes. And I thought, I had my notepad in my hand. I thought, I'm just going to put my notepad away because I won't be writing anything down. I thought, and so I was scanning the horizon, trying to work out, well, what does an RPG look like when it's fired? That was the attitude of the Americans. They wanted the insurgents to shoot at them. But unfortunately, I was in the vehicle. Luckily, it never actually happened. Then, there was a particular day, 13th of December, Saddam was captured, but on that particular day, I was actually leaving Iraq. A colleague and I, Andrew Marshall, who was a Scot, we were on our way barreling across the Iraqi desert, bound for Jordan, Amman, Jordan. I'd finished my assignment, my 2 months, my stint was over, and I was going out for a break. Saddam had been pulled out of this spider hole, but the Americans didn't announce that until the next day. And so we didn't know. And by the time we landed, we flew to London, and the very next day, we arrived at Heathrow Airport. Andrew got a text from his mother on his little old Nokia phone. I'm sure you all had those little Nokia phones, which said it must be exciting in Baghdad right now. Andrew looked at me and he said, I bet they've caught Saddam. And he called the bureau. Yes, he'd been captured. Luckily, Reuters, we'd been first with the news. I was absolutely gutted that I'd missed being there for this story. This was, in my view, was going to be the biggest story of my life, and I wasn't there. Everywhere I went in London, I saw that ugly mug's face. Everywhere I went, TV screens, newspapers. But it was only later, it was years later, that I realised that actually covering the stories of ordinary people were just as important. What I also learned later was that looking after the mental health of my teams and taking care of people and mentoring people was also really important. And in any case, a year after Saddam was captured, there was a 9.1 magnitude earthquake off the coast of Sumatra. On the morning of Boxing Day 2004, I was driving to a Starbucks in Jakarta. I had my son, Harry, who was 2 years old at the time, in the car seat. I was just going to get my wife a coffee. I was actually on annual leave. And I had the an Indonesian news radio station playing, just listening to the news. I spoke Indonesian. And callers were calling in saying there'd been this really powerful earthquake off in Aceh. And when I got home, I checked the Reuters news wires. There was nothing. I checked the Indonesian language news service, nothing. So, which wasn't unusual. So I just wrote a 2-paragraph news story, sent it to our editing desk in Singapore, just saying what I'd heard on the Indonesian radio, the accounts of this powerful tremor in Aceh. A little while later, the US Geological Survey, which measures earthquakes around the world, reported that a 9.1 earthquake had hit off the coast of Sumatra, 150 kilometres off the coast, with a very shallow, and it was very shallow. I knew that this was going to be a massive story. I asked our duty reporter to try to call some people in Aceh. He couldn't get through. I called an aide to the Indonesian president, who said, "We know as much as you do." I went straight to the office. We couldn't reach anyone. And then about 2 hours later, our bureau in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, started putting out alerts of massive waves hitting the coast of Sri Lanka. That's our earthquake, I thought. And as everyone will know, this earthquake off the coast of Sumatra sent massive waves right across the Indian Ocean, barreling into countries all around the Indian Ocean, as far as East Africa. US government modelling showed that the waves that slammed into Aceh were up to 30 metres high, 100 foot. It's hard to actually imagine how big that is. 166,000 people were killed in 20 minutes in Aceh. When I got there a couple of days later, one of the first things I did was I walked into the main mosque in Banda Aceh, the capital, not that mosque that you see on the screen there, but a different mosque, but actually shaped very much like that. I had to walk past debris-filled streets, cars, bodies, everything you could imagine. And I walked into the mosque, and there were bloated, blackened corpses laid out everywhere. And people were walking past, looking, presumably, for loved ones. And I counted every single body in that mosque, and I got to 158. Years later, when I was on my first psych ward admission, I told my psychiatrist about this, about counting these corpses. And she said, "Why did you do that?" And I said, "A news story needs specific details." But I said it was more than that. They deserved to be counted. This is the village, a little township called Lepung, which we couldn't even get to until a month after the tsunami because bridges had been washed away and roads had been washed away. It had previously, the whole area had been home to about 10,000 people. There was not a single building left standing after the tsunami swept through. When I got there, I found several dozen men digging graves with shovels, nothing else. They told me they had several thousand bodies to bury. I remember calling my boss on my satellite phone. I said, I've got a story for today. Aceh Town, utterly shocked, buries its own. At the same time, I had a young family. 2 Indonesian kids that Mary, my wife, and I had adopted, Patrick on the left and Belle in the middle there, and we had our own biological child, Harry. I loved being a dad. I loved the fun and the games we played, but I had a bag packed at home, ready to jump on a plane and go where I had to be if the story broke. And that affected my kids. After my first assignment to Baghdad, when I came back, Harry had just turned 1, he just started to walk. He actually didn't really recognize me. And I look back, and I sometimes wonder if it was worth it. In 2006, I'd been posted to Jerusalem as the Deputy Bureau Chief for Israel and Palestine. The family came with me. We lived there for a year, covered the war with Israel's war with Hezbollah. It was during this time that Iraq started to really slip into civil war. And while I was in Jerusalem, the bosses called me up and they said, would you be interested in being the bureau chief in Baghdad? Would you be interested in applying for the job? It's coming up. And I spoke to Mary, spoke to my wife, and we agreed that it would be a good move, a good career move. The idea was the family would come back to Australia while I went to Baghdad. We never once discussed what the impact might be on my mental health. We never once talked about how I might be affected. Journalists just didn't talk about PTSD in those days. So I went to Iraq at the start of 2007 as the bureau chief. We had an operation that comprised about 100 people across the country. This was the world's biggest story. America had 160,000 troops in Iraq at that time. That's me on the roof of the Reuters office, which was a 2-story house. The BBC is just behind me there with the sat dishes, and those shields you can see on the side there were set up to stop gunmen on rooftops from firing at us when we were doing live crosses for TV. Each of our houses had 3.5 metre high blast walls. We had guards with AK-47s set up at each checkpoint. We lived in the red zone. That's where we worked. We weren't inside the green zone, which was the government compound and where all the embassies were. The so-called cradle of civilization, Iraq, was the most dangerous country in the world. Suicide bombers in cars, trucks, on motorbikes, or just on foot would detonate themselves every single day. Sometimes they were so close to our office that they'd blow the windows in. Dozens of bodies were found in ditches and by the roadside each day. It was hell on earth. On the morning of July 12, 2007, I was sitting in what was called our slot desk. The slot desk in any big news operation that Reuters ran was the person who ran the daily news flow. So if stories were coming in, they were responsible for writing the main story of the day. They had the main phone line. It was mid-morning and I heard shouting outside, screaming. All of a sudden a young cameraman burst through the door and he cried out. I asked an Iraqi senior journalist who was sitting next to me what was going on. He said, Namir and Sayed have been killed, possible US helicopter attack. As it turned out, a young photographer and a driver who worked for us had been killed in a US helicopter gunship attack, along with 10 other people. You might be familiar with this footage. It was later released by Julian Assange at WikiLeaks. Julian called the tape collateral murder. And that's a still image. Those two men, Namir Noor Eldin and Sayed Chum, they worked for me. I was their bureau chief. I was responsible for their safety. They died on my watch. Many years later, the family and I, we moved back to Australia after 20 years or so of living and working overseas. Still working for Reuters, I was editing stories from home in Evandale. But it wasn't long before the past started to catch up to me. Intrusive images started to appear in my mind. I started to have nightmares. In my sleep, I was being chased by gunmen through the streets of Baghdad. I would actually run in my sleep. My toenails would scratch the end of our old Javanese wooden bed. I'd wake up in the morning and Mary would say, "You've been running again." I became an absolute nightmare to live with. Any sudden noise would set me off, door slamming, plate dropped on the floor. And for years, Mary tried to get me to go and see a doctor, go and see a psychologist. She knew that I had PTSD. She knew I was struggling. But after what I'd been through in my journalistic career, I thought, how can there be anything wrong with me after what I managed to get through? But the other thing that stopped me from listening to my wife was my masculinity, my manhood. I just couldn't believe that my wife would be right. The only place I could find peace was here, in the rainforest. In the Tasmanian rainforest was where my mind could be at peace with itself, but that was an escape. Until in the middle of 2016, the guilt and the shame that I felt over the deaths of my Iraqi staff became so overwhelming that I became suicidal. And I ended up in Ward 17, which is a specialist psychiatric unit in Melbourne, in the Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital, where a lot of veterans and first responders go for treatment. Mary had insisted that I go to Ward 17 for treatment, or to a mainland facility for treatment. And this is where I ended up. And I felt a lot of fear at times during my career. I was frightened for my life at times. But this was a different kind of fear. Going through that glass door of that psych ward for the first time was a different kind of fear. You don't put psych ward admission on your CV. I knew that my journalism career was over. The bosses weren't going to send me on the big stories anymore. But I had to do it. And when I walked into those doors, within days, the men and women in that psych ward, the coppers, the veterans, the ambos, they embraced me like a brother. And that human connection that I felt and experienced in that psych ward, it's something that I'll treasure until the day I die. And it wasn't just the human connection I got from my fellow PTSD sufferers, but it was the clinicians in Ward 17 that I felt that human connection with as well. And I found that the care and the support I got was just extraordinary. I found clinicians who wanted to actually understand what it was to be me and understand what I was going through. And in my very first session with my psychiatrist, I sat down with her. She was actually a woman born in Iran. Her name was Mariam. And she asked me to tell me about my career and what had happened. And I sat there and I was rattling off all these dates and names and places and death tolls and so on. And I went on for about 20 minutes. And at the end of that, she said, "Dean, I feel like I've been sitting here listening to a journalist telling a story, but I want to hear your story. I want to hear how you feel about what you've experienced." And it was like a light bulb went off in my head. I thought, she gets me. And I said to Mary that night, she really gets me. And that was the start of a therapeutic relationship with my psychiatrist that was a real turning point for me. And the other turning point was with this young spiritual care worker here called Kath Taylor, who understood the moral dimension of what I'd experienced in losing my staff. And that human connection I had with these folks, at no time did anyone say, "It wasn't your fault, don't blame yourself." And when it came time for me to try to work out what I was going to do with the guilt and the shame that I felt about the deaths of my staff, I had a partner. I had partners in that psych ward environment who helped me deal with the guilt and the shame that I felt. And when the 10th anniversary of the deaths of my staff was coming up, I couldn't cope with it. And so I had to go back for my second admission to the psych ward. And it was there with Kath that we planned a ceremony. We planned a memorial service, basically, that I hoped would be a way for me to pay tribute to my dead staff. And as you can see, I've got some candles there. I had photos framed. Mary sent me some little wooden blue wrens, which represented the souls of my dead staff and also my soul. Because as Mary said, I was a casualty of that day as well. And then at this memorial service, which we had in the chapel of Ward 17, I went into that service with a 5,000-word handwritten letter that I read to my dead staff, asking them to forgive me for not protecting them. Kath, my spiritual care worker, she went into that ceremony having planned it so that I'd forgive myself, and that's exactly what happened. My employer of 25 years, Reuters, they saw me as damaged goods as soon as I came out of that psych ward, first admission. In fact, none of my editors even called me when I was in the psych ward. No messages of support, nothing. And within weeks of getting out, I was told that I was going to be forced into the Australian workers' comp system. Effectively, they tried to force me out of the company. And that abandonment, that the trauma of being tossed, or when they tried to toss me on the scrap heap like that, was harder to deal with than any of the trauma that I experienced in the field. And I felt what happened to me was just so similar to the veterans, the coppers, and the ambos that I saw and met in Ward 17. But then my mates rallied around me. One of the things about my PTSD was that I didn't reach out to friends. I didn't reach out and tell people what I was going through. But as soon as they heard that I'd been in the psych ward, they came down to Tasmania. And this photo is taken at a little place called Fraser Creek Hut in the Tarkine. I'm not sure if any of you fellows from the West Coast have been there. Amazing place, maintained by a fellow called Terry Reid, former National Parks Ranger. And every year we get together now, and it's become a thing that we do for our mental health. That connection, so important for us. And all through this has been Mary, my wife, my kids, just that rock solid support. When I was thinking of writing a book, I thought, no one wants to read a book about another foreign correspondent's experiences, but Mary was the strongest supporter. And she said, you've got to do this. And in the end, I thought, if I write my book, then I can help share the experiences of those men and women in that psych ward who are not able to tell their own story. And a couple of years ago, my son Harry said to me, he said, one father went into Ward 17 and a better father's come out. And to me, that spoke to me of the transformation that I've been through. These days I get a lot of meaning talking about my journey at venues like this, at forums like this. I love talking about it, and I like to get people to think about the importance of good mental health, especially in the workplace. I like to get people talking about these sorts of things. All that time I spent writing my book, those 7 years, what I concluded was that ultimately for people, what matters in trying to recover from trauma and trying to heal from trauma is that it's not just one thing, or it's not just psychotherapy, but that it's the power of people's networks that really matters. It's the support that they get, and it's how those networks all come together and how they enable people to find meaning, renewed meaning in their life, and how that then gives people a sense of purpose. And for me, if I was to sum up what my book is about, it's about the power of human connection and how that sustained me and nourished me. And I think that's what the men's sheds are about. the power of human connection. And so when I stand here today, I'm just very honoured to be here, because I think what the men's sheds represent is something that all Tasmanians can be very proud of. Happy to take any questions if anyone's got any.
How long ago did you write the book?
It came out 2 years ago. Yeah.
So then I went to your launch in Devonport with your book.
All right, thank you.
The reason I went because I was mid-shed and I understood the situation. And anybody who I thoroughly recommend that you go out to the library or wherever and buy a copy or whatever. Magnificent book. And the only problem is I got you to sign it, and your worst handwriting I've ever seen.
I think, yeah, well, I was going to say, doctors' handwriting is usually pretty bad, but my handwriting's shocking, I must say, yeah. I do know for a fact that in the Tasmanian library system there are 8 copies of the book. So if anyone wants to borrow a copy through Tasmanian libraries, there are 8 copies there, so easy to get hold of.
And worthwhile, worth the trouble.
Thank you.
Question from our doctor.
Doctor.
Dean, I've heard. Is it going? Dean, I've heard a lot of discussion from Peter Gresty, who went through a significant event, and from Bruce Shapiro on Late Night Live.
Yes.
Would you talk a bit about how you develop resilience to stop this happening?
Yeah, I met Peter in Baghdad many years ago. We had a bit of a chat in this little laneway between our offices. And I saw the documentary that was made recently about his experience. I think to develop resilience after you've been through these life-changing experiences takes a few important elements. You need the support, you need social support, you need family support, you need friendship support. What's really important though is you have to have organisational support as well, and I think that's often lacking. And that's why a lot of people do struggle, is when they go through these difficult times, they feel that the organisation doesn't have their back. And that's when they feel betrayed. If you have the organisation behind you, you feel like that, yeah, those risks that I took and those sacrifices that I made were worth it. But when the organisation treats you like damaged goods, that just compounds the trauma. But yeah, so if you've got the family support, the social support, good psychotherapy, but then on top of that, you've got to, I think for a lot of people I've met who've been through these traumatic situations, they then need that renewed meaning and purpose in their life. You know, they're looking for direction. And so that's also really important. Does that make sense?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Down the back there.
G'day, mate.
Yeah.
Where was that place on the west coast that the retreat or whatever you call it?
Yeah, Fraser Creek Hut. You get to it via, there's like a little car park. It's not far from Zian.
Right.
Yeah, if you type in Fraser Creek Hut, you'll find it. There's some, and then Terry Reid is a retired forest ranger who has access to it, and he has like a little visitor's book. It's about a 3-hour walk from it is absolutely magnificent. It's an old miner's hut that was built in the 1930s.
Yeah.
Sleeps about 6.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
It's on the Tasmanian Scouts website.
That's it.
How to book it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think it was actually when Terry Reid was in Queenstown, he had it as a he got the Scouts to go up there to do some maintenance. That's right.
Did Routers finally kick you out, or did you be able to hang on?
Yeah. So So there were people trying to get rid of me, but then what happened was I actually wrote about my PTSD. I wrote a story about it. And the people trying to get rid of me had to back off because the story was quite well. The story it was quite well publicised.
Right.
And then Reuters decided to create a role for me as the head of journalist mental health, global mental health.
Right.
And I did that for a few years, but I got such resistance to trying to make mental health a priority for the news organisation that I had to leave in the end. That was also doing my head in. Yeah.
Okay, one final question down the back there, Bob.
Are you still living in Tasmania?
Yes, just moved into the lovely suburb of Trevellyn in Launceston. wouldn't want to live anywhere else than Tasmania.
Just one day.
Oh, yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Well done.
Dean, that was absolutely outstanding. I think we can do one more round of applause. We're so lucky to have Dean with us today. Absolutely brilliant. I'm going to ask our treasurer now, David Gray, to come and make a special presentation to you.
If you'd like that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dean. Enlightening and particularly meaningful there. And you align it with the Men Shed movement and not going. And not going. Right. This one work? Yep. Yeah, so you sort of align it with what we do and what happens within the sheds, and I certainly recognise that. It's something that I've said a few times. What happens in the sheds, you know, with the human connection, is something that you can't really measure.
Yes.
And it's really, really subtle and really, really powerful at the same time. And I think that's the beauty of what we do and the power that's in it. And yeah, you talk a little bit about how people have said this to you and people have said that to you. I remember a few years ago, a fellow, he's a house painter, and he's not particularly well educated. He's got a really, really good story anyway. He's become a good friend of mine. And we were talking about something one day, and he just turned around to me and he said, Dave, you know, he said, everybody has to make terms with their past at some time, you know. And I just thought, yeah, you know, we do have to forgive ourselves.
Yep.
Like you found that you have to forgive yourself so you can move on. And we're often much better people than we personally think we are. So forgive yourselves and move on. And thank you very much for your time.
No, welcome, Dave. Thank you very much.
Small bit here. Sorry?
You've got to explain how you make it and
Oh,
your chaos
no,
board.
I can't tell you how I make them. Well, when I start to make them, and I look at all the parts on my bench, I think I've lost my mind. But as they've come together, they're actually called a chaos board. So this is chaos. And I like to think there's a little bit of order around the chaos. So maybe it's...
I find that very appealing.
yeah, it sort of fits you.
Yeah.
So I hope it does you well. There's a little bit of board wax there.
Very nice.
So keep it maintained and it should last a long, long time.
Oh, that's lovely.
Thank you very much.
Ooh, very
some
nice.
more bits of stuff.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Dean. Please do. Now, as we're about to continue on, and we've got another half